Heroes in the Dust, the Buffalo Soldiers and a Truth. Forensic researchers found, when they extracted ancient DNA from the skeletal remains of unidentified soldiers buried in unmarked graves near frontier forts in New Mexico and Texas, genetic signatures tracing directly to West African communities. Men who had crossed the Atlantic in chains, survived enslavement, fought a civil war for their own freedom, and then volunteered to serve in one of the most isolated and dangerous postings in the United States Army. The Buffalo Soldiers were created by an act of Congress on July 28, 1866, 1 year after the end of the Civil War. The legislation established 2 all-black cavalry regiments, the 9th and 10th, and 2 all-black infantry regiments, the 24th and 25th. The men who filled these ranks were predominantly formerly enslaved people and free black men from the South and the border states. Many had served in United States colored troops units during the Civil War. Approximately 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and re-enlisted because the Army, despite its profound inequalities, offered something the post-war South did not: regular pay, structure, literacy instruction from regimental chaplains, and a legal identity as soldiers of the United States government. The name Buffalo Soldiers was given to them by the Comanche and Cheyenne warriors they encountered on the southern plains. The origin of the name has been debated. Some accounts say it referred to the soldiers' dark, curly hair, which reminded warriors of the buffalo's mane. Others say it reflected the ferocity and tenacity with which the men fought, comparable to the wounded buffalo that was sacred and central to plains culture. A third interpretation holds that the heavy winter coats the soldiers wore resembled buffalo hide. What is clearly documented across multiple oral tradition sources is that the name was used with a quality of respect and that the soldiers understood it as such and accepted it with pride. The 10th Cavalry formally incorporated a buffalo into its regimental crest in 1866. Service records found in the National Archives document that the Buffalo Soldiers were systematically issued older weapons, worse horses, and fewer supplies than white units serving in comparable theaters, and that despite these disadvantages, they compiled one of the lowest desertion rates in the entire United States Army during the Indian Wars period, a statistical fact that speaks to a motivation for service that went beyond the ordinary. Between 1866 and 1898, Buffalo Soldiers served across Texas, New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and the Dakota Territory. They built roads and telegraph lines, escorted mail coaches and supply wagons, mapped terrain that had never been formally surveyed, and protected the settlements and railroad construction crews that were expanding the American frontier westward. They did this work in extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme isolation, in forts that were often little more than adobe walls and canvas roofs at the edge of the known map. Among the individual stories that the historical record has recovered is Cathay Williams, the only documented woman to serve in the Buffalo Soldiers, having enlisted in 1866 under the name William Cathay. Born into slavery in Missouri, Williams served for nearly 2 years before being discharged when a military surgeon discovered she was a woman. Her story was not widely known until the 20th century and has only recently been integrated into the standard historical account of the regiment. 23 Buffalo Soldiers received the Medal of Honor for actions during the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War of 1898. The first was Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz of the 9th Cavalry, cited for actions in Texas in 1870. Their names, for most of the 20th century, were absent from the popular histories of the American West and from the curricula that shaped public memory of the frontier era. Archaeological survey records filed with the United States Army Corps of Engineers and the New Mexico State Historic Preservation Office document the discovery of unmarked burial sites near several former frontier forts: Fort Craig, Fort Stanton, Fort Davis, and Fort Selden. where the remains of soldiers who died in service were interred in conditions that made subsequent identification nearly impossible. The standard burial practice on the frontier was functional rather than ceremonial. Soldiers who died of disease, injury, or in combat were buried as close to the fort as practical, often in graves marked with wooden crosses or simple headboards that deteriorated within years. When forts were decommissioned, most of the frontier posts were abandoned between the 1880s and 1900s. The graves were frequently left behind. Maintenance stopped. The markers rotted. The land was transferred to private ownership or absorbed into federal territory, and the graves became invisible. A major complication for any genealogical or forensic investigation of Buffalo Soldier remains is the fire that destroyed a substantial portion of the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis on July 12, 1973. An estimated 16 to 18 million military service records were destroyed, including records for Army personnel discharged between 1912 and 1960, and personnel records for many earlier periods. The building had no sprinkler system. The fire burned for 4 days. Firefighters poured millions of gallons of water into the structure, destroying additional records through water damage that the flames had not reached. The loss was irreplaceable and is considered one of the greatest archival disasters in American history. For researchers trying to connect skeletal remains to named individuals, the destruction of those records removed the most direct route to identification and made the case for DNA genealogy all the more urgent. Forensic geneticists found, when they applied ancient DNA analysis to skeletal material recovered from identified Buffalo Soldier burial sites, a genetic landscape that mapped directly onto the documented geography of the transatlantic slave trade, and that provided a biological confirmation of origins that the soldiers themselves, stripped of surnames and family histories by generations of enslavement, had largely been unable to document. DNA extracted from dental pulp and dense cortical bone, the two tissue types most resistant to degradation over more than a century of burial in varied soil conditions, yielded mitochondrial and Y chromosome profiles that were compared against modern population reference databases. The results showed strong clustering with populations from West and West Central Africa, the regions of present-day Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Senegal, and Angola that were the primary sources of enslaved people transported to North America between the 17th and 19th centuries. Isotope analysis of the skeletal remains, which records the chemical signature of food and water consumed during childhood and adolescence when bones are forming, showed signatures consistent with agricultural diets high in maize, supplemented by game meat and domestically raised animals. This carbon isotope profile is consistent with childhood spent in the American South, where maize was the dietary staple of enslaved communities, rather than in Africa directly. The strontium isotope ratios, which reflect local geology through drinking water, further confirmed origins in the eastern United States. Together, the genetic and isotopic evidence confirmed that most of the soldiers were American-born men, the descendants of people who had been enslaved for one or more generations before them. Men for whom Africa existed as origin and memory, rather than lived experience. Genealogical research programs, established through partnerships between the Smithsonian Institution, Howard University, and several regional historical societies, have used the genetic profiles recovered from Buffalo Soldier remains to conduct a systematic search for living descendants, an effort that has produced some of the most emotionally significant forensic genealogy matches in recent American history. The methodology follows the same basic approach used in criminal forensic genealogy. Compare the ancient DNA profile against databases of voluntarily submitted consumer DNA test results, identify candidate relatives through shared genetic segments, and then use documentary genealogical research to trace the family tree forward from the candidate to a potential descendant of the soldier. The process can take months and requires cooperation between genetic genealogists, archivists, and historians. The disruption of family records by slavery is the central challenge. Enslaved people were legally property before 1865 and were listed in records by first name only, if at all. The surnames adopted after emancipation were often the surnames of former enslavers, or selected at the Freedmen's Bureau offices where millions registered their new legal identities. The genealogical trail before 1865 is frequently a wall, a discontinuity where documented family history should be. DNA genealogy can reach through that wall by establishing biological connection independently of any written record. When a match is confirmed, when a living person's DNA aligns sufficiently with an unidentified soldier's remains to indicate a familial relationship, the result can reconnect a family to a history that slavery, poverty, and institutional neglect had severed for 5 or 6 generations. Skeletal and archaeological evidence found with Buffalo Soldier remains at multiple frontier sites documents the physical reality of their service lives in ways that written records either did not capture or were never preserved. A biological record of labor, injury, and resilience written into the bones themselves. Forensic analysis of skeletal material from confirmed Buffalo Soldier sites shows patterns of physical stress consistent with heavy manual labor and extended periods on horseback. Vertebral compression consistent with carrying heavy loads, hip and knee joint wear consistent with decades of riding, and healed fractures in the hands and forearms consistent with the occupational hazards of frontier military life are common findings. These men worked their bodies hard, in conditions that the official record, focused on battles and commanders rather than on the daily physical toll, rarely documented. Personal objects found in burial contexts provide a more intimate record. Pipe fragments, coins worn smooth by handling, buttons from uniforms, and occasionally small objects of personal significance, carved wood, fragments of cloth, items whose original purpose can only be guessed, were buried with the soldiers or found in the soil immediately surrounding them. These objects are the material residue of interior lives, the things a man kept close, carried through campaigns, and was buried with when there was no family present to take them home. The presence at some sites of objects associated with African religious and protective traditions, small bundles of herbs and minerals, items consistent with what researchers in African diaspora studies describe as protective charms, documents the persistence of spiritual practices that were suppressed under slavery, but survived in private, and were carried west by men who brought their whole cultural inheritance with them into the frontier army. Legal and administrative records found in the files of the Army Board for Correction of Military Records document decades of effort by descendants and advocates to secure formal military burial honors for Buffalo soldiers whose remains had been recovered from unmarked or unofficial graves. A bureaucratic process that required establishing identity through DNA before any official recognition could proceed. The basic legal framework is straightforward. Any identified United States veteran is entitled to burial with military honors in a national cemetery, with a government-issued headstone bearing the soldier's name, rank, and dates of service. The barrier for Buffalo Soldier remains was identification. Without a confirmed name, the formal recognition could not proceed regardless of the physical evidence that the remains were those of a soldier. DNA identification changed the calculus. Once a skeletal profile could be matched to a named individual through genealogical database comparison and documentary corroboration, the legal pathway to formal reburial opened. The process has been used successfully in a small number of cases, producing formal military burial ceremonies that closed gaps measured in generations. A separate dimension of the recognition effort involves documented cases of Buffalo soldiers who were court-martialed under circumstances that historians have subsequently characterized as racially motivated or procedurally improper. The 1917 Houston riot trials, in which 63 black soldiers were court-martialed after a confrontation with local police and civilians, resulted in executions and life sentences that subsequent historical review has found deeply troubling in their procedural failures. The Army's formal exoneration process does not require DNA evidence, but in cases where identity was uncertain, genetic confirmation of who a soldier was has supported the broader historical case for review and recognition. Epigenetic research, published in journals including Nature Genetics and the American Journal of Human Genetics, has established, over the past 2 decades, that severe and sustained trauma, including the multi-generational trauma of slavery, leaves measurable biological marks on gene expression that can be detected in descendants generations after the original events. The mechanism is epigenetic rather than genetic. The DNA sequence itself does not change, but chemical markers, primarily methylation patterns, that control which genes are expressed, can be altered by extreme stress and transmitted to offspring through both biological inheritance and the early developmental environment. Studies of descendants of Holocaust survivors, communities that experienced severe famine, and populations affected by intergenerational poverty have found epigenetic signatures distinguishing them from populations without comparable histories. The effects are measurable in stress hormone regulation, immune function, and metabolic responses. What the Buffalo soldiers' DNA adds is a specific biological marker set associated with survival under extreme, sustained stress. The physiological adaptations of people whose ancestors survived the Middle Passage, enslaved labor, and frontier military service. Research comparing genetic profiles from Buffalo Soldier remains against modern African American population databases has identified variants associated with stress hormone regulation, cardiovascular efficiency, and immune function at elevated frequencies. The research is ongoing and interpretations are cautious, but the direction is consistent with what epigenetic theory would predict from multi-generational exposure to these conditions. Oral history accounts collected at historically black universities, Howard, Fisk, and Tuskegee, in the early 20th century, preserve descriptions of cultural practices within the frontier regiments that the official military record never documented. The interviews were conducted as part of a broader effort by black scholars, including W.E.B. Du Bois, and historians associated with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, to record African American experience before the last living witnesses passed. The social world inside a Buffalo Soldier regiment was not simply a transplanted version of white military culture. The men brought with them traditions from the communities they had come from, musical forms that would eventually feed into the development of jazz and blues, communal practices rooted in African American church culture, and in some cases, elements of West African spiritual tradition that had survived slavery in modified forms. Former enslaved people from coastal South Carolina and Georgia brought Gullah cultural practices. Men from Louisiana brought elements of Creole tradition. The regiments were not monolithic. The archaeological evidence at some sites supports the oral history. Objects recovered from sleeping quarters and personal spaces, not just from grave contexts, include items that archaeological anthropologists working in African diaspora studies recognize as consistent with protective and healing traditions documented in enslaved communities across the South. Their presence at frontier forts in New Mexico and Texas, hundreds of miles from the communities where those traditions were practiced openly, documents the determination with which men carried their cultural identities with them into an institution that otherwise required them to subordinate everything personal to military uniformity. Commemorative records and burial ceremony accounts from the past 2 decades document a series of formal military reburials at national cemeteries across the American Southwest. Ceremonies in which skeletal remains that had lain in unmarked graves for more than a century were interred with full military honors, under headstones bearing names that DNA genealogy had recovered from the silence of the historical record. The ceremonies follow a standard form: a casket draped with an American flag, a detail of soldiers in dress uniform, a bugler playing taps, the 3-volley rifle salute, and the folded flag presented to the next of kin. What makes these particular ceremonies different from ordinary military funerals is that the next of kin are meeting, for the first time, an ancestor they knew existed only as a rumor. A family story passed down through generations about a great-great-grandfather who had been a soldier, whose name had been lost, whose grave had been unknown. The Buffalo Soldier's story is not simply a story about the past. It is a story about what the past does to the present, about how the erasure of identity under slavery extended forward in time through the loss of records, the destruction of archives, and the systematic exclusion of black military history from the national narrative. DNA genealogy cannot undo that erasure entirely. It cannot restore the documents that burned in 1973 or recover the names that were never written down in the first place. What it can do, and what it has done in specific verified cases, is reach across a century and a half of silence, find the biological thread that connects a man buried in desert sand to a living person in a modern city, and say, "This was your ancestor. He served. He was brave. He was here."